Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. Over the past few weeks, we've brought you extensive coverage of South Africa's 2009 elections. We'd now like to begin a process of post-elections analysis. To assist us, we're joined in the studio by Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa. Ebrahim, good morning.
Hi, morning.
Obviously, these elections saw the ANC once again securing its position as South Africa's ruling party by a wide margin. How would you interpret the size of the party's winning margin? And on the other hand, what significance do you place on its failure to have secured a two-thirds majority?
Well, I think let's begin by putting to rest the bogey of the two-thirds. And I suspect that for very many psychological and other reasons, the ANC would have liked to have had the two-thirds majority. I suppose they would have liked to have had the two-thirds majority to shore up their own support base. They could turn around in society and to the international world, of course, and say that they have an overwhelming mandate over two-thirds, and therefore they're able to drive through a kind of policy regime and governance trajectory that they would have decided simply because it would have shored up and given them the confidence that they would have required simply to push through perhaps even fairly unpopular policies and governance trajectories. However, they also would have liked, I suppose, to have had the two-thirds so that they could make certain changes to the constitution. Now, this is not as nefarious as it might sound. I'm not convinced that they would have liked to have had the two-thirds so that they could change certain of the fundamental either rights or aspects or separation of powers and functions in the constitution. What they would have liked, I suspect, is that given that we since 1996 don't have a provision, for example, for a two-deputy president system, as we may have had between the period 1994 to 1996. The Constitution's fairly clear in referring to a deputy president. They would have liked to have had two deputy presidents. Now, this may again be a question of function and mandate and redefining the functions and mandates of people in the executive. So perhaps that might be one of the other reasons they would have liked the two-thirds. But I'm far from convinced that they would have wanted the two-thirds to really effect massive changes either to the structure of the constitution or doing away with some of the fundamental rights and other rights, which incidentally they would have required 75%, particularly for aspects of the Bill of Rights. Those can't be changed without 75% majority. So I think there are certain practical reasons why they would have wanted the two-thirds, but secondly also the question of the psychological boost to driving through a governance and policy trajectory that they would have liked to have done. Now, whether they got the two-thirds or not, I think now becomes moot, literally because they've got 65% of the share of the votes. However, we should also place the 65% or whatever percentage they would have got in its proper context. And that context is that let's look at the voter turnout. And it is indeed quite high, hovering at about 78, close to 78%. But that's 78% of people who are registered voters, that is people who are on the voters roll, which is 23 million. There's a further roughly 6 million eligible voters. That means people who could have voted, who are eligible to vote, who are citizens, but who don't appear on the voters roll. And then if we look at the proportion of South Africans who actually have voted for the ANC, the number as a proportion of the population or voting age population as a whole comes down. And then of course as a population, as a proportion of the population size, roughly 48, 49 million, that mandate does come down. However, that said, it is a fairly popular mandate. The mandate will give the ANC the power, I think, in legislative institutions and in the executive to drive through a policy regime of their own making. But this ultimately, I think, will depend on the kind of political and policy fractures within the African National Congress and the alliance broadly. So what we've seen in terms of oppositional politics over the last 15 years, largely within the alliance, that is alliance partners holding the ANC to account, pushing pressure on the ANC and pushing it in certain, I think in some instances, even fairly progressive directions. So the influence of the alliance partners, contrary to what people would have us believe, has in fact in many instances been progressive. on the ANC. And so if you look at COSATU's proposals, ranging from everything from the social welfare system to the political system as a whole, they are fairly progressive in its orientation and their content. For instance, the adoption of a mixed electoral system, broadening the social welfare net, creating a national health insurance system. So those are fairly progressive. But at the same time, I think Labour is going to have to enter into a new social contract, not with business alone, but with society as a whole. Because if one of the ANC's key policy trajectories is about creating decent work, and decent work is about moving away from casualization, about social protections which are built into jobs which are created, then of course our productivity levels are going to have to increase concomitantly. So that bargain is going to have to be struck. Irrespective of all of this, in terms of the electoral result as we speak, the 65%, as I say, is a popular mandate. However, it will depend on the kind of political and policy fractures within the ANC. But therein lies the conundrum. And that conundrum is that not only is the contestation of a policy in the ANC set to intensify, I suspect, over the next year or so, but we should also not forget this mandate comes in the context of roughly 5,000 social protests over the last decade. And so I think South Africans are signaling fairly clearly three things. A, that there is a support for procedural and substantive democracy at the same time, in the sense that people are willing to participate in formal processes of decision making and formal processes of democracy. At the same time, they are also keenly aware of the kind of democratic dispensation that the Constitution does provide, and that is to allow for political expression outside of the formal processes of democracy, hence direct action, hence taking to the streets. But I think South Africans have also signaled fairly clearly, and this may not be directly a product of the election result, but clearly what happened in the ANC in Polokwane since roughly the middle of 2006, is that the idea of democracy as elections, the idea of democracy as a set of rights in which people can express themselves, but at the same time the idea of democracy as a set of separations of powers and functions in the executive, in the governance system, is people are also keenly aware of that. And I think what happened in the ANC in 2007 was a clear indication that if there are perceptions that a leader seems to overstep his or her mark in exercising his or her power, then they will in one way or the other be held to account. So I think that's a healthy signal for where our democracy is going. However, while that may also be true, we should also be cautious in the way in which we interpret the election result this time. And I think there are early indications, even though we haven't yet drilled through all of the election data yet, is that there does seem to be a return to a degree of racial census voting. That is, people voting on the basis not just of their political identities, but they are also refining their political identities in some way through the element of race. And so if we look particularly at the Western Cape, you have a block of minorities who voted for a particular political party. And so in the long run, that may be something we ought to watch out for.